At 0730 hours on November 1, 1943, Lieutenant General Alexander Vandergrift stood on the bridge of the command vessel Macaulay, watching the coastline of Bougainville emerge through the morning fog. In 2 hours, 14,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division would storm the beaches at Empress Augusta Bay. The Japanese had 110,000 troops stationed at Rabaul, 250 miles to the northwest. These forces were supposed to stop exactly what Vandergrift was about to attempt, but they did not arrive. Vandergrift had commanded the Marines at Guadalcanal. He knew what awaited when assaulting a fortified Japanese position: heavy losses. Island fighting in the Solomons had caused thousands of casualties for objectives barely marked on maps. Tarawa would demonstrate the same lesson 3 weeks later: over 3,000 casualties to secure an island just 2 miles long. Rabaul was far larger. Rabaul was a fortress that made Tarawa appear like a training exercise. The Japanese had converted Rabaul into the most heavily defended stronghold in the South Pacific. Captured from a small Australian garrison in February 1942, the Japanese spent 20 months transforming it into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Simpson Harbor could accommodate 100 ships. 5 airfields surrounded the harbor. Lakunai and Vunikano were pre-war Australian strips expanded with concrete runways. Rapopo opened in December 1942 on the coast, 14 miles southeast of town. Sparrow was finished in August 1943, midway between Vunikano and Rapopo. Karavat sat on the northern coast, 13 miles southwest. Together, these airfields featured protective revetments for over 400 aircraft and runways capable of handling Japan's heaviest bombers. 367 anti-aircraft guns covered every approach to Simpson Harbor and the airfields. 43 coastal defense guns safeguarded the beaches. 6,000 machine guns were positioned in bunkers and pillboxes. The Japanese army had carved hundreds of miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock, creating underground barracks for 20,000 men, hospitals capable of treating thousands of wounded, ammunition depots holding tens of thousands of tons of explosives, and command centers buried deep enough to withstand any bombing. By mid-1943, over 110,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were stationed at Rabaul. It was the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific. Allied strategy had always aimed to seize Rabaul. Every key document since Guadalcanal pointed to a single objective: capture Rabaul. Control Rabaul, and you controlled the South Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur described it as the theater's linchpin. Admiral Ernest King identified it as the primary target for 1943. The combined chiefs of staff approved Operation Cartwheel specifically to encircle and take Rabaul by March 1944. But intelligence estimates highlighted a problem. Taking Rabaul would cost more American lives than any engagement since the Civil War. The Japanese had learned from Guadalcanal and every 1942 island battle. They knew Americans would employ naval gunfire and air superiority. They knew Marines would establish beachheads, so they constructed defenses designed to turn these advantages into liabilities. The tunnels rendered strategic bombing ineffective. Anti-aircraft guns meant air support would be costly. The garrison's size implied achieving numerical superiority would require stripping troops from other theaters. Rabaul's geography offered only 3 possible landing beaches, narrow and covered by overlapping fields of fire from positions fortified for 18 months. Analysts estimated an amphibious assault would result in 30% casualties. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later wrote that Tarawa, Iwima, and Okinawa would have seemed mild compared to the bloodshed that would have occurred at Fortress Rabaul. By mid-1943, planners projected 60,000 assault troops would suffer 18,000 casualties, assuming everything went perfectly. Those numbers did not include Japanese reinforcements from True, weather delays, or failed naval bombardments. A different approach was needed. The first American commander to die attempting Rabaul was Brigadier General Kenneth Walker, who led the 5th Air Force Bomber Command under General George Kenney. At 44, Walker was a theorist who believed strategic bombing could win wars without ground invasions. He had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School and spent his career arguing that properly applied air power could destroy any target. Rabaul was his opportunity to prove it. Walker flew his first mission over Rabaul in September 1942. The raid achieved nothing. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire repelled the bombers before they could inflict serious damage. But Walker believed persistence would succeed: strike repeatedly, harder each time, destroy aircraft on the ground, sink ships in the harbor, crater runways. Eventually, the base would become unusable. On January 5, 1943, Walker led a daylight raid on Simpson Harbor with 6 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 6 B-24 Liberators. The plan was to strike Japanese transports before they departed for New Guinea. General Kenney had ordered a dawn raid to avoid enemy fighters, but Walker postponed it until noon, insisting the bombers needed daylight to form up properly. 12 bombers attacked high noon against the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. The Japanese were ready. Fighters from 3 airfields scrambled to intercept, and anti-aircraft guns opened fire from positions encircling the harbor. Walker's B-17, tail number 44 to 12,458, San Antonio rose, took immediate hits. He pressed the attack, leading the formation through intense flak. His bombardier scored direct hits on Japanese vessels. Then 15 Japanese fighters engaged the formation. Walker's bomber, already damaged and trailing smoke, could not maneuver. 4 to 5 Zeros focused on the lead aircraft. Other crews watched San Antonio Rose lose altitude, heading toward the water, its number 3 engine smoking. The fighters followed into the clouds. Neither Walker nor his 10-man crew, nor the wreckage, was ever recovered. Walker was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, presented to his son by President Roosevelt on March 25, 1943. The citation lauded his conspicuous leadership and valor, but did not mention that the raid failed to stop the convoy or that strategic bombing alone could not neutralize rabble. Walker remains the highest-ranking American officer listed as missing in action from World War II. The second major attempt came in October 1943. By then, Allied forces had captured nearby airfields sufficient to support sustained bombing. General Kenney planned a massive strike on October 12, 349 aircraft, the largest formation ever assembled in the Southwest Pacific, B-25 Mitchells, B-24 Liberators, P-38 Lightnings, Australian Boomerang fighters, everything available. The raid struck all 5 airfields simultaneously. Bombardiers reported devastating effects. Kenney's after-action report claimed over 100 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, multiple fuel dumps ablaze, runways cratered. Theater commands sent congratulations. MacArthur issued statements declaring Rabble's air power neutralized. It was not true. Japanese engineers repaired runways in 36 hours. Most fuel dumps were empty. The Japanese had moved supplies underground weeks earlier. The aircraft losses were exaggerated. Fewer than 20 planes were lost, most already damaged and awaiting repair. Photographs made the raid look impressive, but Rabble remained operational. Kenney tried again on November 2. 72 B-25 medium bombers and 80 P-38s attacked Simpson Harbor at low altitude, strafing and bombing. It was the 5th Air Force's most dangerous mission. The Japanese had reinforced Rabble the day before with 173 carrier aircraft elite pilots from Zuikako, Shokaku, and Zuho. Admiral Koga had detached his best aviators to defend Rabble. These pilots were waiting. The American formation entered what survivors later called the fiercest battle the 5th Air Force faced in the entire war. Fighters engaged at the harbor entrance. Anti-aircraft fire from ships and shore created walls of steel. The B-25s pressed on, flying so low their propellers threw spray from the harbor water. They hit several ships and strafed aircraft revetments. 9 B-25s did not return, and 10 P-38s were lost. Among the dead was Major Raymond Harold Wilkins, commanding officer of the 8th Bombardment Squadron, 3rd Bombardment Group. Wilkins, 33, from San Bernardino, California, had flown 86 prior combat missions. On his 87th over Rabble, he led his squadron through intense anti-aircraft fire. His aircraft was hit multiple times, but he continued his bombing run, destroying a Japanese destroyer and a 9,000-ton transport. His bomber, trailing smoke and losing altitude, could have turned for home. Instead, Wilkins made a strafing run on a heavy cruiser to draw fire away from his squadron. His aircraft was shot down and crashed into Simpson Harbor. All 6 crew members were killed. Wilkins received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The November 2nd raid cost 19 aircraft and over 60 men killed or missing. In exchange, the Japanese lost 20 aircraft and suffered minor damage to 2 cruisers. The raid had not neutralized Rabble. It had barely touched it. By mid-November 1943, American commanders were looking at a year's worth of raids and seeing failure. Heavy losses, minimal results. A Japanese base that remained operational no matter how many times they hit it. Strategic bombing had not worked. Not because air crews lacked courage, but because Rabble was too big, too well defended, and too easy for the Japanese to repair. The ground campaign looked no better. American and Australian forces had been fighting up the New Guinea coast since January. Every mile caused casualties. The jungle terrain was worse than anything seen in the Solomons. Dense rainforest, steep mountains, disease-carrying mosquitoes, impossible swamps. Malaria struck down entire battalions. Dengue fever caused temperatures that reached 104 degrees. Dysentery weakened men until they could not walk. Tropical ulcers infected the smallest cut and spread until flesh rotted. More soldiers were evacuated for disease than for wounds. at Buna and Gunna on the northern Papua coast. The campaign lasted from November 1942 through January 1943. Australian and American forces fought for 3 months to clear 2 small coastal villages defended by 6,500 Japanese troops. The Allies committed 13,000 soldiers. 1,000 became casualties. Over 7,000 Japanese were killed. The fighting was close range, brutal, desperate. Japanese bunkers built from coconut logs absorbed 30 caliber bullets. Flamethrowers became the only effective weapon. Men fought hand-to-hand in swamps and jungles. Bodies lay unburied for weeks in tropical heat. The smell of death permeated everything. When Buna finally fell in January, American commanders realized they had stumbled into a new kind of warfare. The Japanese would not retreat, they would not surrender. Every position had to be taken by direct assault against defenders who fought until killed. If Buna cost 3,000 casualties for 2 villages, what would Rabaul cost? At Nassau Bay on the New Guinea coast in late June 1943, American forces from the 41st Infantry Division landed to support Australian operations against Salamaua. The landing was supposed to be unopposed. Intelligence reported the beach was undefended. The intelligence was wrong. Japanese forces contested the landing. The Americans got ashore but spent weeks fighting through jungle and swamps to link up with Australian units. What planners thought would take days took 6 weeks. Casualties mounted not from major battles, but from constant small unit actions, ambushes, snipers, and disease. At Lae in early September 1943, MacArthur launched his most ambitious operation yet. The 5,003rd Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped onto Nadzab airfield while Australian 9th Division landed amphibiously at Lae. It was perfectly coordinated. MacArthur himself flew over Nadab to watch the paratroopers jump, standing in the open doorway of AB-7 bomber. Despite staff protests about the danger, the landing succeeded. The airfield was captured. Australian forces pushed inland, but the Japanese 51st Division defending Lae did not collapse. They conducted a fighting retreat through jungle mountains toward Finch-Halfen. The Australians pursued, losing men to ambushes and exhaustion. 2 weeks of operations cost the Australians 400 casualties. The Japanese lost over 2,000 killed, but many more escaped to fight elsewhere. Lae was captured, but the enemy army remained intact. The pattern repeated across New Guinea. Finch-Halfen fell in October. After bitter fighting, the Huon Peninsula was cleared by January 1944, but Japanese forces withdrew in good order. Every objective took longer and cost more than estimated. Every Japanese unit fought harder than predicted, and every victory simply moved the front line closer to Rabaul, or 110,000. Japanese troops waited in the strongest defensive position in the Pacific. Allied planners looking at these campaigns saw mathematics that did not work. If taking a village cost 3,000 casualties and required 3 months, and if capturing an airfield cost 400 casualties, required 2 weeks, then assaulting Rabaul with its 5 airfields, massive garrison, and prepared defenses would cost casualties beyond anything the Allies had suffered. The numbers were inescapable. The idea that changed everything did not come from a single brilliant staff officer working late one night. It came from years of strategic thinking that stretched back to 1921 when Major Earl Hancock Ellis of the Marine Corps wrote War Plan 712, Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. Ellis had proposed that the United States could defeat Japan by capturing key islands while bypassing others, strangling Japanese garrisons by controlling the sea lanes. The concept had been refined by Admiral Raymond Rogers in War Plan in Orange of 1911, but those were theoretical plans for a hypothetical war. In June 1943, as Allied forces fought through the US Solomons toward Rabaul, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee in Washington began questioning whether capturing every Japanese base made strategic sense. Their analysis noted that assaulting Rabaul held small promise of reasonable success given the fortress's strength. Committee members argued that if American forces could control the sea and air around Rabaul, the base itself became irrelevant. The key advocate for Bypassing Rabble was General George Catlett Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. Marshall was 62 years old in 1943. A strategic thinker who saw the Pacific War in terms of logistics and casualty ratios, not glory or conquest. He had spent the first 2 years of the war fighting for resources against British demands for European priority. Every division sent to the Pacific was a division unavailable for the planned invasion of France. Every ship committed to island fighting was a ship not carrying supplies across the Atlantic. Marshall calculated resources the way an accountant calculated budgets. He looked at intelligence estimates for Rabble and ran the numbers. Assaulting the fortress would require at minimum 60,000 assault troops, probably more like 75,000 with support units. Those troops would come from divisions scheduled for Europe or from units already stretched thin in the Pacific. Casualties would run 30 to 40%. In the first 2 weeks, that meant 20,000 to 30,000 killed and wounded. Replacing those losses would take months. Training their replacements would take longer, and even if the assault succeeded, Rabble itself provided no value that justified the cost. It was a base, not a strategic objective. Capturing it accomplished nothing except denying it to Japan, which could be accomplished by isolation. Marshall presented this analysis to the Joint Strategic Survey Committee in June 1943. The committee agreed. Their report noted that assaulting Rabble held small promise of reasonable success and would seriously delay subsequent operations. They recommended neutralization through air and naval power while advancing through positions that offered less resistance. But recommendation was not policy. The Joint Chiefs would have to approve it, and the Joint Chiefs included officers who believed strongly that major enemy positions must be captured, not bypassed. In the Pacific, General George Churchill Kenney reached the same conclusion from different reasoning. Kenney commanded the 5th Air Force under MacArthur. He was 53 years old, an innovator who had pioneered skip bombing, low-level strafing attacks, and other tactical developments. After watching his bombers batter Rabble for months with minimal results, Kenney realized something fundamental. You could not destroy Rabble from the air because the base was too large and too dispersed. The Japanese had spread their facilities across hundreds of square miles. They had buried critical installations in tunnels. They repaired runways within hours. No amount of bombing would eliminate the base. But Kenney also realized you did not need to destroy Rabble. You just needed to neutralize it. If Allied forces could build airfields within fighter range of Rabble, those fighters could sweep over the Japanese base daily. Bombers could crater a runways faster than the Japanese could repair them. Fighters could shoot down any transport attempting to land. Submarines and patrol bombers could sink any ship trying to enter Simpson Harbor. The garrison would be trapped, unable to receive supplies, unable to launch aircraft, unable to interfere with Allied operations, defeated without invasion. Kenney took this concept to MacArthur in July 1943. MacArthur's initial response was negative. He had been planning to capture Rabble since early 1942. His staff had invested months developing invasion plans. His entire Southwest Pacific strategy pointed toward Rabble as the culminating objective. Bypassing it felt like retreat. It felt like leaving the job unfinished. MacArthur told Kenney the idea had merit, but expressed concerns about operational security, Japanese reinforcement capabilities, and what the press would say about avoiding a fight. Kenney persisted. He showed MacArthur projections of what the air campaign could accomplish once Bougainville airfields became operational. He described how submarines could blockade Rabble. He noted that the combined fleet was already withdrawing heavy ships from the base. He argued that time spent assaulting Rabble was time not spent advancing toward the Philippines, and returning to the Philippines was MacArthur's obsession. That argument resonated. By early August, MacArthur had shifted from opposition to reluctant acceptance. He did not endorse bypassing Rabble enthusiastically. His messages to Washington still emphasized the importance of capturing the base, but he stopped actively fighting the concept and allowed his staff to develop contingency plans for isolation rather than assault. Admiral William Frederick Halley came to the same conclusion through battlefield experience. Halley commanded the South Pacific area. He had been fighting through the Solomons since taking command in October 1942. He had seen Guadalcanal turn into a 6-month bloodbath. He had watched good men die on New Georgia, capturing airfields that could have been bypassed. He had lost ships, lost aircraft, lost Marines to diseases that spread through jungle camps. On August 15, 1943, Halsey implemented the first pure bypass operation of the Pacific War. Instead of assaulting the heavily fortified Japanese base on Kalambanga in the Central Solomons, he landed troops on lightly defended Vela La Vela to the northwest. The operation succeeded brilliantly. American forces built an airfield on Vela La Vela while the Japanese garrison on Kalambanga sat isolated and irrelevant. 6 weeks later, the Japanese evacuated Kalambanga without American forces firing a shot at the base itself. Halsey had proven the concept worked. In August 1943, the Combined Chiefs of Staff met in Quebec for the Quadrant Conference. The gathering brought together American and British military leadership to coordinate strategy across all theaters. The question of what to do about rabble dominated Pacific discussions. Prime Minister Winston Churchill attended with his chiefs of staff. President Franklin Roosevelt brought Marshal King and General Henry Arnold of the Army Air Forces. The conference lasted from August 17 through August 24. Marshall presented the case for bypassing rabble on August 19. He had prepared meticulously. He brought maps showing rabel's defenses, intelligence, estimates of garrison strength, casualty projections for amphibious assault, and alternative plans for isolating the base. His presentation was methodical, logical, devastating. He argued that assaulting rabble would cost more American casualties than the pass allies could afford while achieving no strategic advantage that could not be gained by isolation. The fortress controlled no essential territory. It threatened no vital installations. It existed as a threat only if allowed to operate. Deny it the ability to operate, and it became irrelevant. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations, supported Marshall. King was 64 years old, abrasive, difficult, brilliant. He had been fighting for Pacific resources against European priorities since Pearl Harbor. He knew exactly how many ships, aircraft, and men were available. He knew what operations were planned for the Central Pacific drive through the Marshalls and Maranas. He told the combined chiefs bluntly that the Navy could not support both the rabble invasion and the Central Pacific offensive. One operation had to be sacrificed. The choice was stark. Spend resources taking a fortress that achieved nothing strategic or spend those resources advancing toward Japan. King voted for advancing toward Japan. MacArthur's representatives at Quebec continued arguing for capturing rabble. Brigadier General Stephen Chamberlain represented Southwest Pacific area interests. Chamberlain was MacArthur's operations officer, intelligent, loyal, committed to his commander's vision. He argued that bypassing rabble would leave a dangerous threat in Allied rear areas. He predicted the Japanese would use rabble to raid American supply lines. He warned that failing to capture such an important base would be seen as weakness, would damage American credibility, would embolden Japanese resistance elsewhere. Marshall countered every argument with casualty figures. He asked Chamberlain directly, "How many Marines is rabble worth? 20,000? 40,000? At what point does the cost exceed the value?" Chamberlain had no answer. The question was unanswerable because rabble had no strategic value that justified any casualties at all. It was a base. Bases could be isolated. Marshall pressed his advantage. The British chiefs of staff sided with Marshall. They were fighting in Burma, facing their own resource limitations, watching casualties mount in Italy. They had no interest in seeing American resources consumed in a battle that achieved nothing except denying Japan a base that could be denied through isolation. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, noted acidly that the Americans seemed capable of losing men taking islands, but less capable of advancing toward strategic objectives. Better to bypass the
fortress and keep moving. On August 24, 1943, the combined chiefs issued their directive.
Rabble would be neutralized by air and naval action, but not captured.
Allied forces would seize positions on Bougainville, the Green Islands, and the Admiralty Islands to establish airfields within range. These airfields would maintain pressure on Rabble, prevent reinforcement, interdict supply, and contain the garrison.
The fortress would be left to wither.
MacArthur would redirect forces planned for the Rabble invasion toward operations in western New Guinea and eventually the Philippines.
Hawley would continue advancing through the Solomons, but avoid costly assaults on heavily defended positions.
The formal directive
reached MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane on September 17. MacArthur read it in his office overlooking the
Brisbane River. His staff waited for his reaction. They had spent over a year planning to capture Rabble. Maps covered the walls showing landing beaches, phase
lines, objectives, intelligence files detailed Japanese defenses, logistics
plans, calculated shipping requirements, training programs, prepared assault units. All of it was now obsolete.
MacArthur sat silent for several minutes. Then he called in his chief of staff, Major General Richard Sutherland, and told him to begin replanning.
The objective was no longer a ball.
The objective was the Philippines.
Rabble would be bypassed. Forces designated for the assault would be redirected to operations at Hollandia and Etap in New Guinea. The schedule would accelerate. They would reach the Philippines months earlier than previously planned.
Years later, MacArthur would claim in his memoirs that bypassing strong points had always been his strategy, that he had pioneered the concept, that the Joint Chiefs had simply confirmed his tactical genius. The historical record shows otherwise.
MacArthur opposed the bypass until the Joint Chiefs ordered it. But MacArthur
was intelligent enough to recognize when he had lost an argument and pragmatic enough to turn defeat into advantage.
If the Joint Chiefs wanted bypass operations, MacArthur would give them bypass operations on a scale never imagined. He would leapfrog across New Guinea, leaving entire Japanese armies isolated and irrelevant. The Philippines became his obsession. Rabble became a footnote.
What happened in the next 6 months proved the bypass strategy worked
better than anyone expected. The test began on November 1, 1943, when 14,000
Marines of the 3rd Marine Division landed at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville under Lieutenant General
Vandergrift's command. The Japanese garrison at Rabble tried to interfere. They dispatched a cruiser force from True to attack the landing. Admiral Halsey responded by ordering carrier strikes on Rabble itself. On November 5, Rear Admiral Frederick Coleman Sherman commanded Task Force 38, built around the carriers Saratoga and Princeton.
Sherman was 58 years old, a naval aviator who had been flying since 1917.
He knew the risks of sending carriers against a land-based fortress.
Rabble had over 300 anti-aircraft guns and
could launch hundreds of fighters.
But Hal's orders were clear.
Hit the Japanese fleet before it could reach Bougainville. At dawn on November 5, Sherman launched 97 aircraft from his 2 carriers.
71 came from Saratoga, 26 from Princeton. The strike package included Dauntless dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers, and Hellcat fighters. They flew 250 miles to Rabble, arrived over Simpson Harbor at first light, and
caught the Japanese cruiser force at anchor. The attack lasted 18 minutes. American dive bombers screened down
through anti-aircraft fire and put bombs into 6 of the 7 heavy cruisers in the harbor.
A Targetgo was hit by near
misses that killed 22 crewmen including her captain.
Maya took a bomb in her engine room that killed 70. Momi was set afire with 19 dead. Takao suffered 2 bomb hits and 23 killed. Shikuma and the light cruiser Anno were damaged. By
the time the American aircraft turned for home, the Japanese cruiser force was crippled. Sherman lost 9 aircraft and
14 airmen. Naval historians would call it Pearl Harbor in reverse, the first successful carrier strike against a heavily defended land base. 1 hour after the carrier strike, 27 B-24 liberators from General Kenny's 5th Air Force hit Simpson Harbor with 58 P-38 Lightning escorts, adding to the damage. By the end of November 5, the Japanese combined fleet had learned a lesson. Simpson Harbor was not safe. The cruisers limped back to Truk. The Japanese Navy never sent another heavy surface ship to Rabaul. Without naval support, the Rabaul garrison could not contest the Bougainville landing.
The Marines established their beachhead
Unopposed.
Within 3 weeks, the Marines had built an airfield on Bougainville.
On November 9, Major General Royer arrived to take command of 1st Marine Amphibious Corps, relieving Vandergrift. Gidger was 58 years old, one of the Marine Corps' pioneer aviators. He had been flying since 1917 and understood how air power could dominate a battlefield. Under his command, the Bougainville airfield became operational. In early December,
American bombers immediately began hitting Rabaul from 250 miles away.
The second test came in late December when Marines landed at Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain. The operation secured the strait between Opi, New Britain and New Guinea, opening sea lanes for Allied shipping. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul tried to reinforce Cape Gloucester. American submarines sank 2 of 3 troop transports before they arrived. The third turned back. The Cape Gloucester landing succeeded with minimal casualties. By January 1944, Rabaul was surrounded.
Allied airfields on Bougainville, New Britain, and the Green Islands kept constant pressure on the
base. Fighters swept over Rabaul daily, shooting down any Japanese aircraft that attempted to take off. Bombers cratered the runways every night.
The Japanese could repair them, but could not use them. Simpson Harbor became a graveyard of sunken ships.
Supply convoys stopped attempting to reach the base. The 110,000 troops were cut off. Other American commanders watched what
happened at Rabaul and realized the strategic implications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Central Pacific area, saw the bypass succeed and applied it to the Marshall
Islands.
Instead of attacking heavily fortified bases at Wat, Malope, and Mal, he bypassed them entirely and captured lightly defended Kwajalein and
Amtok. Bypassed garrisons were isolated, unable to interfere.
MacArthur used the same strategy in New Guinea, bypassing Japanese concentrations at Matanyan Waiwak, landing at Hollandia hundreds of
miles west. The Japanese 18th Army found themselves surrounded by Allied airfields with no way to fight back. By March 1944,
the bypass strategy had spread across the Pacific theater.
Planners no longer assumed every enemy position required capture. They asked different questions. Could we bypass it? Could we isolate it? Could we accomplish objectives without contesting this ground? The answer increasingly became yes. Numbers told the story.
In the 12 months prior to the Rabaul bypass, Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific incurred over 15,000 casualties, securing positions that offered minimal strategic value. In the 12 months afterward, casualties fell below 8,000. While the rate of advance more than doubled. Troops moved faster, lost fewer men, and achieved superior results. The nature of the Pacific War had shifted for the Japanese.
Awareness came gradually, then all at once.
The first hint of change emerged in late November 1943 when the Rabaul garrison reported American forces had landed on Bougainville but were not advancing toward Rabaul. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo assumed it was a diversion. The main attack would come later. They instructed the garrison to prepare for an invasion. The invasion never arrived.
December passed. January passed. Americans continued building airfields and bombing Rabaul, but never deployed troops. By February 1944, Japanese commanders recognized they were being bypassed.
110,000 troops, the largest concentration of Japanese forces in the South Pacific, sat in a fortress the enemy had opted not to assault.
Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka commanded the Southeast Area Fleet at Rabaul.
At 52, he was a career naval officer who had overseen construction of the airfields, tunnels, and fortifications. He had prepared for the decisive engagement when American Marines would storm the beaches and the garrison would fight to the last man. He had never prepared for being ignored.
Kusaka's initial reaction was bewilderment. Why bypass such a vital position? Rabaul controlled key sea lanes and threatened any Allied advance.
Leaving it intact seemed a fatal error.
He waited for the invasion he believed inevitable.
But as weeks turned into months and the only Americans he observed were bomber crews at 20,000 feet, confusion turned into comprehension. The Americans did not need to seize Rabble.
They had already neutralized it.
Without ships, Rabble could not project power. Without aircraft, the airfields were ineffective.
Without supplies, the garrison could not endure indefinitely.
Kusaka ordered troops to plant gardens, cultivate their own food, and prepare for a siege that might last years. He knew the war was over for Rabble the moment the last supply convoy turned back in January 1944.
Everything thereafter was waiting.
Other Japanese garrisons observed Rabble and felt their strategic position unravel.
At Truk, the main fleet base in the Caroline Islands, commanders realized that if Americans could bypass Rabble, they could bypass Truk.
They began withdrawing the fleet westward. At Waiwak in New Guinea, the 18th Army occupied fortified positions, waiting for assaults that never came while Americans landed 400 miles behind them at Hollandia.
At Cavian on New Ireland, the garrison entrenched itself and watched American ships sail past toward other targets.
The psychological impact was severe. For 2 years, Japanese strategy relied on defending key positions, holding islands, controlling sea lanes, and making every American advance prohibitively costly.
The bypass strategy shattered that reasoning.
It did not matter how heavily fortified a location was if the enemy simply avoided it. It did not matter how many troops were concentrated if those troops could not maneuver. The defensive perimeter Japan had spent 2 years constructing was exposed as an illusion.
Japanese pilots reported American tactics evolving.
American ships appeared in unexpected locations.
Bombers struck targets previously thought unreachable. Marines landed on supposedly isolated islands.
Americans advanced faster than Japanese forces could react because the Japanese fleet was too damaged, aircraft too few, and supply lines too vulnerable.
By mid-1944, Japan had lost strategic mobility.
They could defend positions they held, but could not counterattack, reinforce threatened areas, or evacuate bypassed garrisons.
Americans controlled sea and air, dictating the tempo and direction of the war.
The transformation was complete. In early 1943, Japanese commanders believed Rabble was essential to holding the Southwest Pacific. By late 1944, Rabble had become a prison, 110,000 troops confined in tunnels, growing vegetables in volcanic soil, awaiting relief that would never arrive.
Americans had defeated Rabble without setting foot on it.
They achieved victory by rendering it irrelevant.
The bypass strategy received no formal recognition during the war.
No ceremonies honored the choice not to attack Rabble. No medals were awarded for preserving 20,000 lives by electing not to fight.
The Joint Chiefs issued a directive. Commanders executed it.
The war progressed. General George Marshall returned to Washington post-war, serving as Secretary of State, then Secretary of Defense.
He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953 for the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe.
When historians questioned him about the Pacific War, Marshall called the decision to bypass Rabble one of the most consequential strategic choices of the conflict. He estimated it saved tens of thousands of American lives and shortened the war by months. He did not claim personal credit, emphasizing it as a collective decision made by military professionals who balanced casualty estimates against operational objectives. General George Kenney remained in the Pacific until Japan surrendered, commanding the Far East Air Forces during the occupation. He retired in 1951 and published his memoirs, asserting he had always believed air power could neutralize Rabble without ground assaults. Admiral William Halsey became a national hero, returning home in 1945, promoted to Fleet Admiral, and retired in 1947.
He emphasized that bypassing Rabble was common sense once casualty estimates were reviewed. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka remained at Rabble until Japan's surrender in August 1945.
His garrison, isolated for 18 months, suffered massive losses. When Australian forces entered Rabble in September 1945, they found roughly 69,000 Japanese soldiers and 20,000 civilian workers alive. Over 20,000 had perished from starvation, disease, and malnutrition. The garrison had survived better than expected by transitioning to agriculture. They grew rice, sweet potatoes, and tapioca in jungle clearings, fished, raised chickens, and rationed carefully. An Australian general remarked that Rabble had become almost a small independent state. Kusaka was investigated for war crimes but apparently never convicted. The physical remnants of Rabble remain today.
Tunnels carved into volcanic rock are slowly being reclaimed by jungle vegetation.
Airfields are overgrown, runways cracked and broken, revetments collapsing.
Simpson Harbor is clear, wrecks salvaged or rusting on the seabed.
Volcanoes near Rabble erupted in 1994, burying the town under meters of ash, preserving and destroying it simultaneously. A memorial commemorates Australian soldiers who died defending the town in 1942 and Allied airmen who died attacking it in 1943 and 1944, but there is no marker for the Japanese garrison that starved there. There is no plaque for General Marshall, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee, or the thousands of Marines who survived because someone chose not to attack.
The strategic lesson was applied throughout the Pacific.
American planners implemented the bypass strategy at Truk, Waiwik, Kavieng, and numerous smaller Japanese bases. Historians estimate this strategy prevented over 100,000 American casualties by avoiding needless assaults on fortified positions. It accelerated the Allied advance toward Japan and forced Japan to defend everywhere while attacking nowhere, thinning their forces and rendering them ineffective. Strategy does not change overnight through a single brilliant idea, but through collective analysis weighing risks and rewards. And in the end, 110,000 Japanese soldiers remained in a fortress for 18 months, defeated not by combat, but by strategic irrelevance.